Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
This chilly evening, this chilly rainy evening, as we wear matching pants. It's a pleasure.
This is the winter literary outfit.
If you didn't get the
Du
memo,
jour.
now
Yeah.
you know. We're
Yeah.
writing to Vogue this week.
Slightly damp on account of the London and Paris downpour.
Brian, I want to start with a reading from Affinities, because I think that'll help us set the tone and help the audience to understand what exactly this book is about, if this book is even about anything at all. I've marked out the page here.
So sorry, from the start.
Yes.
Okay. So the book has, I'm sure we'll come to this in time, the book has threaded throughout it a series of what I'm calling essays on affinity. And so this is the beginning of Essay on Affinity 1. I found myself frequently using the word affinity and wondered what I meant by it. An attraction, for sure, to certain works of art or literature, to fragments or details, moods or atmospheres inside of them. To a sentence, for instance, or an essay, but just as easily to an impression diffusing in the mind that could not be traced back to source. A fascination with this or that artist, writer, musician, filmmaker, designer, with a body or a body of work. Fascination, already finding words with which affinity has affinities. Fascination as something like but unlike critical interest, which has its own excitements but remains too often at the level of knowledge, analysis, conclusions, at worst, the total boredom of having opinions. But also, the way things, images, and ideas sidled up to each other, seemed to seduce one another, in ways I could not or did not want to explain. So that when I wrote affinity in a piece of critical prose, perhaps I was trying to point elsewhere, to a realm of the unthought, the unthinkable, something unkillable by attitudes or arguments. Not a question of beauty or quality or taste, other eternal aesthetic values. Something fleeting, in fact. Affinities don't all or always last. In the end, and for reasons above as well as others to come, something a little bit stupid. I've been writing about images for about 20 years, finding affinities rather than deploying any kind of expertise, because I'm not an art historian. Still, it felt like an education, a second training in the image after my first in the word. For a long time, I had been saying or writing affinity, but also dreaming, never exactly conceiving, a way of thinking about art, about objects and images that belonged to artists, including the contemporary artists, whose studios I might visit and find myself staring at pictures, not their own pictures, that they had stuck to the wall, books and artifacts on their shelves. I had thought in passing about how these, or the smartphone photographs and notes app reading lists that the artists sent me afterwards, how they sat alongside each other in more or less oblique relations, and then, when I came to write up my encounter with the work, wouldn't easily translate into the language of influence or subject matter or research. How to describe, as a writer, the relation it seemed the artists had with their chosen and not chosen, what's the word? Talismans, tastes, sympathies, familiars, superstitions, affinities.
Now you see why no one else ever has to write nonfiction. Again, it's all been said. It's all been done.
I'm not entirely convinced, unsurprisingly, I'm not entirely convinced by that as an argument. I can't for the life of me remember who said that, but bless them.
So now that we have an idea of the sort of tone of this book, I'm hoping you can walk us through the structure a bit. So you have this central sort of thematic essay-like impulse gesture that's threaded through a series of other reflections. Tell us what we get into when we open these lovely white pages.
So I was I realized only this afternoon, actually, something that I should have realized a long time ago, because it happens continually with my books, where I think I'm writing two books, or I have two books planned. And after some years, I realized that they're actually the same project. It happened with my very first book, which I thought was a book about the history, the philosophical history of thinking about memory, and then realized slowly was actually a book I'd imagined when I was about 25 that nobody would ever want to read. And it happened with this one that I had this idea in my head that I wanted to write about something that I was calling affinity without really knowing what I meant by that word. In the two books that come before this, Essayism, which unsurprisingly is a book about the essay as a form, and Suppose a Sentence, which is a kind of collection, sort of reliquary in a way of sentences that I love, I found myself using this word over and over again. And it, as you've just heard in that passage, it had something to do with the way that artists I would meet, including friends of mine, would talk about their influences or the things they surrounded themselves with. And I sort of thought this had something, it had a kind of relation in my mind to do with poetics, with rhyme, for example. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to try and figure out what that word means, affinity, and to maybe trace a little bit of its history. And at the same time, I had, because I always have, at the back of my mind, the ambition to simply put out another collection of essays. I think it's Jeff Dyer said once in an interview that the only reason he ever wrote real books, including novels, was so that every few years he could put out a collection of his essays, because those were actually the real work. So I had this idea that I wanted to do a book that was mostly about photography, because I've been writing about contemporary art for about 20 years, and I tend more towards writing about film and photography. So, roundabout way to answer your question. These two things came together, and the argument, if it is an argument, it's more a kind of thread of a kind of hunch that runs through those essays on affinity. Alongside that is essentially a collection of pieces, many of which are about specific images. So we start in the 17th century. I think we start in the 17th century. Maybe you can remind me. I haven't looked at this book in so long.
We're about to find out.
We start with Robert Hooke with Micrographia in 1665. And Micrographia includes this rather wonderful image of a full stop or period on a printed page. And so we start, the book moves kind of chronologically. You go from Robert Hooke to Louis Daguerre in 1838, photographing Paris. And it slowly kind of builds, I suppose, a pattern of mostly photographs, including work by really famous artists like Julia Margaret Cameron, Claude Cahun, William Eggleston, Diane Arbus, but also more obscure figures and, I guess, more obscure objects, things that don't necessarily fit the category of fine art as such. And it goes up to more or less the present day. And I chose these things, well, the choosing of them is probably another story or another set of questions. It's not a haphazard pattern, but it's more intuitive than it is historical or critical in some way.
Let's dive into it. Let's dive into the choosing. Tell us about it.
So I wrote this book, or I started the book, in that peculiar period in the middle of the pandemic, when, as a writer, you know, many of us who published books in 2020 felt as if those books simply vanished. My book about sentences came out that year, and when I finished it late in the spring, I was looking around my apartment, and I was looking I was trying to think what the next book could possibly be. And it was a state of mind where you felt in the late spring and early summer of 2020 that this could go on forever. And that actually, if you wanted to carry on making, whether you were an artist or a filmmaker or a writer or a thinker, maybe this is all there was the interior. And that sense that things were closing down and closing around you, I thought, how can I possibly turn that into another opportunity? You know, I'd finished a book that was about sentences that was entirely kind of library bound, and that was a good thing to be doing in the spring of 2020. But what would the next thing be? And I had this idea that I could write a book that was based entirely on a kind of drift among my bookshelves, you know, plucking images and catalogues and so on off the shelves. And that this would be, it sounds so innocent now, it sounds so delightful, that this would be a kind of innocent book. It would be, in some ways, as I say at the start of the book, somehow unthinking and a little bit stupid. Stupid in the sense of perhaps not smart, but also stupid in the sense of being stupefied by that particular historical moment of feeling cut off from the world. And so that was the fantasy, in a way. The fantasy was that you could make a book that was entirely intuition, that was about these kinds of purely emotional, or maybe not even emotional, somehow unthought attachments. And that was obviously a lie, and it was obviously not a book that anybody else would want to read. And so what I've ended up with is something, I hope, something more than that. But that was, and so lots of the choosing, lots of the things that have gone into it, many of them, probably most of them, are things that I had already written about, and that wasn't part of the Affinity plan. But I realized that slowly that there was a kind of lineage of images, not necessarily of artists, but more of images, that made a kind of pattern. And maybe we'll get to what that pattern's composed of in a moment. But does that make sense? It was a kind of fantasy about how you could make a book somehow without thinking that you were writing
Make a book without making a book.
Which is a fantasy that many writers, I think, have, that you can write without writing. I was thinking about this today because I'm writing an essay about W.G. Sebald, and so many writers who feel themselves kind of attached to his work somehow misread something. They think that if you could, I've done it myself, if you could wander the streets of a city, of a European capital, or the hinterland, the flat landscapes of, you know, England or wherever it happens to be, and take the most boring photographs that you possibly can, you would become this thing. You would become this melancholy artist writer, and it doesn't work, because what's involved there is a kind of fantasy that you could be a writer who doesn't write, you know. And what Sebald's doing is something infinitely more complex. But there is somehow this kind of attachment, especially maybe as a writer who spends a lot of time thinking about visual art, that there's a kind of shortcut in making images, or perhaps even in looking at images, that you could find somehow the same levels of profundity or complexity or hilarity or whatever it is you're aiming at as a writer, that you could find them in really simple, straightforward images. And it never works, or I can't think of a writer for whom it works, a writer who makes photographs as good as their words, right? But that's somehow part of the fantasy as well.
What's interesting, it's the fantasy of the book written by no one, right? The book written by the third person, when in fact what insistently sort of returns in this book is the first person. You return, you are there, you step into it, you can't step away.
Is that right? I mean, if
yes.
That's your impression, or if that's any other reader's impression, then that, I'm sure that's right. This was probably not a book. I mean, I do appear in some or many. I'm unsure myself, but definitely in some of the essays, I'm there looking, and in some of the essays, I'm there kind of autobiographically as well. And the other members of my family, there's some of it deals with certain kind of aspects of family history as well. But that sense of the I as a kind of presence is not something, probably in any of these books, that I putting the I into what is is in some ways a kind of critical or essayistic writing, is not something that I feel sort of polemically attached to. You know, it's not a kind of argument. I'm not putting stories about my family, about, you know, my crazy aunt or photographs of my mother or whatever in there because I think that there ought necessarily to be an I in this kind of writing. It somehow just happens. I also think that the kind of subjectiveness that I'm really attached to in other writers about art and writers about literature doesn't actually require the I. You can be just as intimate without it. So I'm always now really interested in how people read that I, because it, to me, it's not kind of doing some programmatic work for me, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And I think you have a sort of very respectable and compelling position in regards to ideology in criticism and the idea that one always has to be offering a thesis, positing something. But I do think that one could perhaps approach the I as sort of affinity itself, as this linking thing, the thing that coheres. I'm going to be wildly annoying about this and bring Immanuel Kant into it, but one thinks of the sort of synthetic unity of apperception, the idea that you are the perceiving thing that is holding all of this together. I'm wondering if we could talk a bit more sort of on that line. You can respond to that, but also about the sort of different definitions of affinity that you try out throughout the book, that you work out. It's a closeness, it's proximity, it's seduction, which is delightful, it's chemical, elemental, it's family. How did you cycle through these different angles from which to approach affinity, and why do you feel that you didn't land upon one single unified definition?
Some of this was the dreaded and extremely no longer respectable kind of following Roland Barthes down the etymological route, you know. And I think probably, I can't remember if it's in this book or one of the others, that I say, actually, you know, this is really embarrassing. I am going to do that move. And I did with this bit, partly because I was very unsure, because I had read Goethe, I'd read the Elective Affinities, and I knew that there was this particular history in chemistry to do with what we think maybe in a cliched way is the kind of attraction of opposites, but it's actually kind of a good deal more complex than that. And I wanted to know how that particular controversy in the 18th and early 19th century happened, where that word had come from. And I started to discover, as you've already hinted, kind of just fantastic kind of happenstance, or not happenstance, but you know, accidents that worked for me, which is that one of which is that affinity historically means both relationships of blood and relationships of marriage. So it means something that is natural and unnatural at the same time. And that seemed to me like a really apt description of how many artists I admire and people that I talk about this with, artists that I know, how they think about the elements that they might move, that they might put into play in a work, whether those are, you know, photographs or objects in an installation or images in a film, that they connect in a kind of intuitive and somehow natural, dread word, fashion, and at the same time they clash they enter in, you know, classic kind of Eisenstein montage, etc. But they have a relationship that is forced and unforced somehow at the same time. And I guess that's the thread that runs through the various definitions of affinity. Maybe that seems like a very basic and simple thing to end up saying.
But I think that's the point, is to get to the most simple, basic definition that you can, to kind of shed away the layers and arrive at the nucleus, which is true.
I hope so. I realized as I was going along that I wasn't all that interested in writing the argument about affinity that would, for example, include Kant and many other philosophers, and that might have been an argument that I might have been interested in making a long time ago when I was more invested in academic writing, and I wanted somehow the book to perform the thing that I was trying to describe. And maybe in a moment we should actually kind of talk about some of the images and artists, because maybe that will make it a little bit clearer. But I wanted the book to somehow embody or enact the thing that in another kind of writing I would have to methodically argue through.
So let's turn to the book itself. Do you want to speak to some of the choices that you made?
Who should we talk about?
There's such a wealth of choices. I do think that because we are in Paris, perhaps we could choose the delightful figure whose name I've forgotten, who is a dandy and who photographs herself in these sort of strange, compelling ways.
Claude Cahun, or whose surname I always know that I'm mispronouncing and can't, and I'm sure that somebody in the room will pronounce Claude Cahun's name better. Yes.
Walk us through the choice of this figure. There's a strangeness to her, and strangeness runs through the book.
As I'm sure that many people will be familiar with the photographs that Claude Cahun took throughout her life, most of which in some way are self-portraits. They're actually collaborations taken with her partner, who curiously was also her half-sister. And
that's an affinity, I have to say.
They were not well known and not well discussed in art historical or kind of wider cultural studies contexts, really until the 1980s. And
that's a theme of the figures that you select for this book. They're sort of minor figures in larger histories, and you address that lack of recognition, that being on the side, then being brought forward.
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, with Claude Cahun, it's definitely true. With some of the others, it's much more complicated, because there is this narrative that can be advanced about some of the other artists, like Eileen Gray, for example, the great Irish architect and designer, that these are people who had been neglected or forgotten about, who hadn't had attention properly paid to them. And actually in some of those cases, and very, very obviously this happens with the female artists in the book, or the queer artists in the book. But actually in many cases, and somebody like the dancer and choreographer Loie Fuller is a really good example of this. Loie Fuller at a certain point in the 1920s was one of the most famous people on the planet. She was in no sense neglected. On the other hand, with Claude Cahun, most of this work, she had various points in her career where she connected with much more famous figures. André Breton was the most obvious, and had various kinds of celebrity. But a lot of the really great work in which she remakes herself, her image, her body, her appearance, in the guise of, it would be easy to say that she's simply androgynous in some of these images, or that she's simply looking masculine. She's something much more myriad and strange and in places alien than that. And I was very interested, that particular essay is based on a big exhibition in London about a decade ago. And I guess I was just interested in some of these essays, were written, and this is a good example, written for readerships that were not primarily kind of art readerships. So I'm telling in that essay a biographical story about this person, but at the same, for people for whom she's they're coming to her fresh, but at the same time trying, as you say, to kind of pay attention to the particular strangeness, again, maybe weak word, but the particular kind of alien quality of specific images. And so she connects, for me, to others. She connects, I think, in this essay, she connects to David Bowie in 1976 or whatever in The Man Who Fell to Earth, when he peels off his what does he peel off? His hair, his skin, not his skin. His irises, he reveals his alien eyes. And that's who she reminds me of. So one of the things that an essay like that is trying to do, I suppose, is to put these images into some kind of play with other parts, mostly of the 20th century.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that's so compelling about this book is that you draw such a compelling portrait of the critic as curator. You are staging these collisions, these interactions, kind of building these little galaxies of images and of words and of texts at the same time.
I guess part of that, and this is something that, two things kind of emerged when I had the kind of pattern of the book more or less in my mind. And if we just name some more names, maybe this is also helpful. Julia Margaret Cameron, as I say, Claude Cahun, Dora Maar, Eileen Gray, Jean-Paul Levy, the great aquatic filmmaker, Hannah Hawke, Loie Fuller, Diane Arbus, Francesca Woodman, Andy Warhol, and many others. And two things emerged. One was that there was, in fact, a certain kind of story about the place of androgyny, and I'm using the old-fashioned word here for kind of 20th century reasons, that partly is a kind of precursor, and it attaches to a lot of much more recent scholarship about queer histories and trans histories and so on. But the particular now antique category of androgyny seemed really important among lots of those artists, and I'm sure that makes sense when you start listing the names. But the other thing, and it's connected, that I totally had not predicted, was that a lot of these images contain or somehow dramatize some sort of, how to describe this, a kind of unruly matter or material that's sometimes a kind of abstract element in the picture, something like a kind of ectoplasmic, sort of effusion. I'm thinking, for example, about Loie Fuller's dance, the butterfly dance. I'm sure many people are familiar with images of her work, or the dance of radium that she did at one point. Fuller writes to her friend Marie Curie and says, "Can you send me a sample of radium? Because I'd like to put it on stage," And Marie Curie writes back and says, "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. No, you cannot have a sample of radium." But Fuller does the dance anyway with pure light, and she enacts on the stage. She performs radium, and she's the kind of most extreme version of it. But there is this thread that runs through the book. It's there in Francesca Woodman's photographs. Those elements in her work that are these almost abstract blurs, these moments of kind of indistinction. And I'm still not sure what that is, except somehow this is what I seem to be drawn to over and over again in many of these pictures. The simple, slightly stupid answer would be to say what you're looking at there is affinity itself, right? But let's not go quite there. But there is something running through the book that's to do with mostly 20th century. It starts in the 19th century with Julia Margaret Cameron and her very, very blurred photographs, or her subtly blurred photographs, rather. But it's mostly a 20th century phenomenon that's partly to do with abstraction, but it's something else. It's something to do with a kind of unruly energy that takes place in the photograph.
There's something, I kind of had the constant impression as I was reading it that it felt adjacent to, but not quite, science fiction. There is something science fictional, something weird to it. Like you said, things that grow, kind of goopy, gross, decaying things as well. I thought a lot of the idea of just the blob, you know, the thing. It's no form, it's no matter, it's just there, it's pure matter.
It's funny, isn't it? When you say that, I realize that although he does appear at the end, Andrei Tarkovsky, his Polaroids are mentioned at the end of the book. You're talking about Solaris, right? The roiling, abstract planet, you know, that is the source and the container of dreams of the worst and the best fantasies and memories. The
slippery things, right? Yes.
Yeah. There could have been an essay in this book about Tarkovsky, just as there could and possibly should have been an essay about David Bowie.
But there could have been, and you talk about this at the end, there could have been an essay on everything in this book. Or not everything, but you include this delightful list of all the other possible affinities that you could have explored. And it's interesting that the book itself sort of becomes the framing device. The book closes the subject, which is an unruly mass in itself, and which could continue to grow and grow and grow. And yet, through the act of writing itself, you've had to close it. Speak to us about these possibilities that you turn towards and yet choose to walk away from.
Well, all three of these books, the sentence book, the essay book, and Affinities, they're partly kind of excuses to make lists, and that, in a way, is also a kind of homage to the great list-making writers. Who are the great list-making writers? I mean, it's almost every great writer you can think of, in a sense, right? It's like Herman Melville, it's James Joyce, it's William Gass. But there's something about the list in this case is, in a way, it too enacts or kind of embodies the principle. Because it's a kind of editing principle, it's simply or curatorial principle of simply sitting one thing alongside another. Most of the really great, I mean, as you said in the introduction, I've curated a couple of exhibitions, but I wouldn't call myself a curator. But most of the really good curators I know would offer no better definition of what they do than simply putting one thing alongside another. Because the energy happens, happens in between. Everything happens in between, and it's a conceit in a way. I wanted the book to end with a list, because the first book, Essayism, begins with a list. But I also did want, in a way, to include, by merely mentioning them, many, many images that, in some ways, are the kind of the alternative book. You know, they're not things that I love less than the images that are treated at greater length. They're just as important. I had a conversation about a week ago with the genius poet and critic Wayne Kostenbaum for an interview for a piece I was writing about him, and he talked about, and this is so brilliant, that the place of proper names in his poetry, because he has a habit of naming often really well-known figures. You know, Jackie Kennedy is in there, and Warhol is in there, and John Ashbery is in there, etc. And we were trying to, I was trying to get him to just to say what exactly is going on when he fills a poem with all of these names, and he said he described it simply as mentioning, and mentioning is an act of generosity in writing, in his writing. And I wonder that really that's going to stick with me for some time. You know, this idea that a kind of openness or generosity in writing is often simply a question of doing something really economically. You know, you just point and say, look, this.
It's there. Yeah, you see it.
And sometimes that's enough. And maybe there was a little bit of that at the end of this book. I wanted to just list some things, and maybe they would mean something in a reader's mind. Maybe you would recognize some of them, but maybe they wouldn't. But possibly they could just they would just hang there, maybe for a little while.
Well, it's
Should we hear some of them?
Yes.
Is that what we're moving towards?
I actually think we're a bit low on time, so we won't hear some of them, because I want to ask one last question. I want to respond to that. I want to say that this idea of mentioning seems not perhaps analogous, but related to what you said about the practice of curating, which is placing things side by side, which is also just a mentioning, just saying, here, look, it's before you take it. It's the giving. I want to talk about these three works in conversation, which is the subject of a whole other discussion. So we're going to try to do it quickly, but it strikes me that the current running through them is precisely what I think you've just touched upon, which is a sort of multiplicity. It's an opening. You know, the epigraph in Essayism with William Carlos Williams says, not only is it necessary to prove the crystal, but the crystal must prove permanent by fracture. It seems like your work is this fracturing, the saying, this is what the book is, but it could have been otherwise, and this is what an essay is, but an essay could also be this. So that's my interpretation, but I'd love to hear yours and hear you tell us what you think the process of linkage that's at work here is, that's making these three books a trilogy. So
it was never intended to be a trilogy, and if you'd said to me when I wrote the first book, you're writing a trilogy, I would have thought that was hopelessly pretentious. But I think that you're right. There's something. I think I say it really explicitly in Essayism, that what I'm trying to describe is this sense, and I don't know where this comes from. I'm trying to write right now a book about education, which is mostly a book about my own education. And so I'm thinking about certain figures like Jacques Derrida and Hélène Cixous, and I don't think that Kant, sadly, is going to be in there. But the critique of judgment is important, probably, in this respect. But there's something about that maybe I learned early on that is to do with an attraction to wholeness, a kind of aesthetic unity, you know, style, which is one of the kind of big themes in the first two books, at exactly the moment where it starts to kind of shiver and disintegrate and fall to pieces. I have no idea why that's so interesting or attractive as a subject, but that seems to be the thing that these books are about. It's somehow tracing a kind of lineage of writers and artists and filmmakers and other forms of making, in which what is admirable is this holding together and at the same time flying apart in all directions. That's not, I mean, that's not a psychological, like I can't say what that is psychologically, you know, except that in other books that are not Fitzcarraldo books, which I guess we should not discuss tonight.
Forbidden.
That I spent a long time writing about ruins, the ruin as an aesthetic form. I made an exhibition about it and so on about a decade ago. It seems that, and I wrote, you mentioned it at the start, a book about hypochondria, which is about anxiety in the body and so on. So there's something running through everything I've done that's about a kind of anxious holding together because things are physically falling apart or aesthetically falling apart.
Can we have
or
a big
something.
Round of applause for Brian, please. I would love to selfishly respond to that, but I must be kind, I must give, and I must open this discussion up to questions from our audience. So we will start with our in-person audience here tonight, and then we'll turn to our Zoom audience if we have time. Raise your hand very high, and Alfonso will bring you a microphone.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you could explain a little bit. You said you curated some art shows. Could you explain how the shows that you curated relate to your book and your writings?
I think I can. Thank you for that question. The first exhibition that I did was in 2013, and it was called Curiosity. And I don't know if people in the room are familiar with a magazine called Cabinet, which is an art and culture magazine that started in 2000 in New York. Its editor-in-chief, Sina Najafi, is now based in Berlin. The magazine is mostly now online. But it was a magazine, it still is in its current form, a magazine devoted to bringing together writers, artists, philosophers, scientists, practitioners in numerous different fields around, in each issue, a particular theme. And the theme might be water, electricity, hair, love, fear, ruins, dust, and so on. So it's a kind of space of intellectual juxtaposition as well as inquiry. And I was asked by the Hayward Gallery in London for their touring program if I would propose an exhibition. And I immediately thought, it's called Curiosity, and it's somehow trying to embody the spirit of the magazine, of Cabinet magazine. And so its guiding kind of principle was the idea of the Cabinet of Curiosities. And it brought together contemporary artists, artifacts from various sciences, and historical artworks, starting with Leonardo drawings. So that, in some respects, has been, and it had a very, very beautiful catalogue that's now worth extraordinary amounts of money because it's so rare. That's probably the progenitor, actually, of all of these books, because it was the kind of moment where, for the first time, I think I'd probably written 5 or 6 books at that stage, but it was the first time where I realized that that sense of miscellany was really productive. That just that moment of kind of judgment, like where does one thing sit alongside another? And that, in a way, is also a kind of definition of what an essay can do. It's one of the things that an essay can do. So that was the first show, and that was, it's one of the most exciting things I've ever done. And it was an exhibition also where the ambition was to make a show that would work for 3-year-olds and for highly sophisticated art world people who were very snobby about everything, right? So it had that kind of sense of, and the other one, which came, I stupidly agreed to curate 2 exhibitions at the same time, and the second one happened a year later at the Tate Britain in London, and it was a historical survey of ruins in painting, photography, sculpture, and so on.
Other questions?
Thanks very much. Thanks. Hi, Brian.
Hello.
Great to see you again. I haven't yet had the privilege of reading your book, so perhaps you write about this in there, but I'd like to ask you, if I may, a little bit about the psychology of affinity, and I suppose behind that also the psychology of authorship. And particularly as I start thinking about this, you mentioned inevitably Goethe, the idea of elective affinity. And I've often wondered, obviously it's the chemical metaphor, the outdated science and so on, but I've often wondered, just sticking with the term, what exactly is the relationship between those two terms? Is it essentially a tautology, elective affinity? Does the adjective qualify and change the noun in some way? I mean, it's even clearer in the German, Wahlverwandtschaft, where it's a chosen affinity. But it's so the question that makes me wonder then about your work and your book is to what extent, I suppose, these affinities are consciously chosen, or whether you feel drawn to things in a way that you are struggling to rationalize why you're drawn to them. I'm guessing that's basically what the book is about in a way, but not having read it, I can't yet say.
I suppose the book sort of is about that in a way, but it's also, you've put this so interestingly and troublingly, may I add, because one of the terms that's kind of missing in everything that I've said so far, and actually is missing in the book, is something as obvious and in a way kind of crass, but also difficult, problematic as taste, right? And I suppose with taste, exactly the same difficulty arises, about intention versus this thing is happening to me, right? And I suppose that in a way, there is something, there is a kind of sleight of hand that's essential to all positive writing about art, where you are saying to your reader, this thing is happening to me. Because you're trying to describe an experience. You're trying to describe something that is each time new. And you're trying to describe it for a reader, and this is always really exciting to me when I'm writing for readers who maybe are not specialists. You're trying to describe it for somebody who hasn't had that experience, hasn't seen the work, or maybe they have seen the work, but you can't assume that they have. And there's a sort of sleight of hand where you're disavowing the intentionality. You're somehow bracketing out the elective element, which is, I have chosen to write about this object, I have chosen to review this exhibition, I have chosen to interview this artist, or to write a book chapter, whatever it happens to be, that you're somehow leaving out the element of constraining and containing your object, and you're pretending that you're somehow in this purely passive kind of relationship with it. And that, I don't know what to do with it, except that I think the book maybe makes that obvious. It makes what you've just described as the kind of tension between the two parts of that term, elective and affinity, makes it obvious without ever really arriving at any proper conclusions about it. One of the things that I set out to do in these 3 books, and I think that I probably can't ever do it again, was to write, I think I say it in the sentence book, I wanted a book that was all pleasure. That I've written 3 books that are somehow pretending that I'm not a critic. And I don't think that I can carry on pretending that I'm not a critic. Do you know what I mean? It's like there was something important about the kind of, I think the phrase somewhere in Walter Benjamin is the kind of the fullness of positivity. That somehow a sense that I wanted to push myself towards the naive side of elective affinity, and somehow for a short while in these books kind of somehow bracket off and disavow the more cynical and directed elements. But you can tell by the fact that I'm describing this and thinking through it in such an incoherent and useless fashion, you can tell that I haven't arrived at any conclusions about this. And this is why I have to write a book about education to figure out where all of this came from.
I disagree with the negative self-talk there. We could practice the fullness of positivity in regards to your answers here too and say that they're excellent. We have time for one more question. Who's it going to be?
A question, good evening. Question from the blue. conversation, you referenced that you had made a work on sanctuary. I'd be curious some of your references for that sphere.
Oh, Sanctuary is a book it's a very short book, and it's my one attempt at writing fiction. And it may never happen again. And it's a book, oh God, it's a short text. I suppose it's a novella of sorts, that is about an artist whose partner has disappeared, and she goes, God, I can't believe I'm explaining this. I'm really glad that almost nobody has ever read this book. It's a book about modernism. It's a book about the ruins of modernism in a very specific context of a 1960s Catholic seminary in Scotland, near Glasgow. And characters kind of exploring this and its history and so on. And it's basically a book in which I'm trying to describe concrete, decaying concrete. And that's the kind of challenge of the book. And the sanctuary is part of the church in the seminary. And this is almost getting to answer your question. The book is partly a kind of reflection on architecture as emotional sanctuary, or as a kind of fantasy about a particular kind of emotional sanctuary, and the desolation of that fantasies. I'm really interested in the architecture, the historical architecture of the sanctuary as part of the Catholic architecture. But that's as far as I've thought or reflected on the idea or the concept of sanctuary, which obviously has many, and since I wrote that book, many more political valences and applications that we could think about. But yeah, that's what it is. It's about a space, but the space is real and it's also fantastic. It's a fantasy as well as a piece of concrete.
Can we have a final round of applause for Brian, please? It was such a pleasure to speak with you tonight about these
very much.
remarkable books. I cannot recommend them enough. We could have talked all night. So if they arrive at Smith & Son, go and purchase them, or purchase them online, or take yourself to England and purchase them there.
I also apologise on behalf of England for the non-arrival, although I'm not English, for the non-arrival of these books. Fitzcarraldo, like many publishers, and especially small independent publishers, has suffered greatly in terms of what it is possible and where it is possible to sell books. Aspects of that have improved recently, but things are still extraordinarily difficult.
And Brian has touched upon Fitzcarraldo, so I'll say that this was the last event of a month that we called Fitzcarraldo February, where we were able to spotlight brilliant authors such as Brian who are published by Fitzcarraldo. So thank you, Brian, and thank you to everyone on the Fitzcarraldo team for coming together and making this happen.